human beings find it, and particularly if human beings working for the media, find it very difficult to believe that there could be such a thing as a human movement which is pure and sincere and totally good and in its intentions. This is impossible for people to believe. So therefore, they're always searching for the weakness or the wickedness which may be hidden underneath. And let's face it, we do it ourselves. I wonder how many of you in this room even did not at some time have doubts about the Gakkai in Japan or about sensei. If we do it, you can hardly blame the media for doing it either. So as you know, I've just come back from attending the Youth Division training course in Japan, which is such a wonderful event. But of course, I know a number of the young people who went, some of you I'm sure are here tonight, were able to clear these doubts from their minds once they found themselves together with members of the Gakkai. And they could see the incredible purity of this movement at first hand. So these are the things, aren't they, which are bound to stir up trouble and difficulty at times. So let's not be surprised about it, and let's not be frightened of it. Because again, just as the gosho says, it's only the worm in the bowels of the lion itself that can destroy the lion. No attack from outside can. And we can always overcome it. And the Gakkai have proved this, of course, time again in their history. So now, let's look at question 3. That's on page 13, in the middle of the page. Okay?
The guest thereupon flushed with anger and said, Emperor Ming of the later Han dynasty, having comprehended the significance of his dream of a golden man, welcomed the teachings of Buddhism brought to China by missionaries leading white horses. Prince Shotoku, having punished Mononobe no Moriya for his opposition to Buddhism, proceeded to construct temples and pagodas in Japan. Since that time, from the supreme ruler down to the numberless masses, people have worshipped the Buddhist statues and devoted their attention to the scriptures. As a result, in the monasteries of Mount Hei and of the southern capital at Nara, at the great temples of Onjoji and Toji, throughout the land within the 4 seas, in the 5 areas adjacent to the capital and the 7 outlying regions, Buddhist scriptures have been ranged like stars in the sky, and halls of worship have spread over the land like clouds. Those who belong to the lineage of Shariputra meditate on the moon atop Eagle Peak, while those who adhere to the traditions of Hakkalanyasha transmit the teachings of Mount Kukutapada. How then can anyone say that the doctrines of Shakyamuni are despised, or that the 3 treasures of Buddhism are neglected? If there is evidence to support such a contention, I would like to hear all the facts.
Thank you. So anyone who wants to discover what Mount Kukutapada is, or Hakkalanyasha, please, you'll find it in the footnotes. I'm not going to go into that tonight. So here, as you see, the traveller representing Hojo Tokuyori is representing righteous indignation, isn't he, at the accusations which Nichiren Daishonin is making. He's saying the country's full of temples. Wherever you go, you bump into monks and priests, all fingering their beads and looking holy. You know, how dare you say that Japan isn't religious-minded and that we're not abiding by the teachings of the Buddha? So he gets truly angry at this time. So, of course, on the surface, Japan was religious. In fact, probably, one could have said in 1945, on the surface, Japan was religious because there were temples all over the place. You couldn't walk down a road without passing a little shrine or the gateway of some temple. But the fact was, of course, that the people weren't really using them. And worse still, the priests were clinging on to their jobs, had very little understanding of the Buddhist teachings in most cases. They were hypocritical, and they were often power-hungry because they knew the only way to stabilize their own security was by having power over the people and influence over the ruling authorities. They were often greedy, self-indulgent, and indeed would even kill, if necessary, to protect that power, though, of course, in a secret way. But that's nothing new to us either in the West, is it? If we look back over the history of the Church, there have been some pretty funny goings-on at times in and around, for example, the Vatican. So it's not new to us either. The Church getting involved, religion getting deeply involved with politics and taking sides in struggles for power. So what about the 12th century? I was in Canterbury yesterday. I went to a fantastic meeting. One district, East Kent district, held a meeting. In fact, it was a sort of introductory lecture by me. And they had 120 people, would you believe it, at it. One district, about 20 to 25 members in NITOC. Really great, isn't it? Anyway, this meeting was right in the heart of Canterbury. And it reminded me of Thomas à Becket, who was slain, murdered on the steps of the high altar of Canterbury Cathedral in the 12th century. I can't remember the actual year. But this was the conclusion of a struggle for power between the Church and the king, who was Henry II at that time. And in the same century, we had two popes. Some of you, when you've been to Treitise, may have visited Avignon, which is quite near to Treitise. So there was one pope in Avignon and another pope in Rome. Can you believe it? Each of them a puppet, really, in opposing political sides, struggling for power. If you go up to Yorkshire, to Fountain Abbey, anyone been there? It's so beautiful. Anyway, if you go and have a look at Fountain Abbey, you see, if you study your guidebook, that the priests used to occupy the most magnificent accommodation on a high level, and the people who worked for them, and the ordinary people, in other words, were, somewhere lower down in rather congested, cramped quarters. This was the way of the Church, wasn't it, at that time? The Church held, in other words, immense secular power as well as religious power. Unfortunately for us, Henry VIII, due to the odd reason of his problem with his karma for women, for which we have to be extremely grateful, really, broke the power of Rome so far as this country was concerned. But there was more in it than that, because he'd already told Wolsey, the cardinal, who was an extremely powerful person in this land, the most powerful next to the king, and he told him to get out of Hampton Court, which the cardinal had built for himself, because he said it was bigger than his own palaces. And he moved into Hampton Court. Henry VIII moved into Hampton Court instead. So this may seem just like a trivial tiff, but that wasn't so, of course. Hampton Court and Cardinal Wolsey represented the incredible power of the Church. And this church, mind you, of course, wasn't a church that was connected with England particularly. That was the Church of Rome. So he busted. And as a result of that, in a sense, freed the people from a great deal of religious pressure and fear, which was exerted by the Church. At that time, of course, I'm talking about the Middle Ages, please understand, but they suffered from considerable repression from the priests. So when Sensei was giving this lecture, he delved into the matter of why it is that religions so easily give in to the temptation of getting involved in politics and power, and analyzed it quite deeply. So I'll tell you a few of the things that he said. First point he pointed out was that the religious practice itself of those religions where there is a temptation to fall into the trap of getting involved in politics, the practice itself is weak. That is to say, it doesn't enable people to carry out their human revolution. And therefore, the three poisons remain rife amongst the leaders. So because of that, they seek power in a political sense. And also, of course, a religion that lacks total confidence in its ability to bring about human revolution desires the security of secular power in order to preserve its entity intact. Likewise, of course, such religions where there is weakness in the teaching are fearful of liberating the people. This applied particularly in the past. Therefore, they kept the people under control through the priesthood and the hold of the priesthood over them in the name of God. So Christianity definitely went through its own middle day of the law, just the same as Shakyamuni's Buddhism did. So Shakyamuni's Buddhism in the middle day of the law in Zoho, just as Shakyamuni predicted, was formalized. The whole teachings became ritualized and very much the province of monks and priests. And it was the time of building great temples and stupas. So strangely, the same thing applies to Christianity. Christianity's Zoho, or middle day of the law, was a bit later, but round about the 13th and 14th centuries, when the great cathedrals were finally completed, and Christianity embedded itself in a very rigid dogma and ritual, and gradually lost touch with the people. And of course, I'm talking in a general sense. So, in a sense, the traveller in the RISSHO ANKOKU RON is mesmerized by what he sees on the surface. He thinks, because there are temples and priests in beautiful robes praying all over the place, that Japan is a religious place. So the same thing, that is the Zoho of Shakyamuni's teachings that brought that about. But the same thing in the case of the West, in Europe. People were mesmerized by the power and splendor of the church and the priesthood, and feared it as a result. So Sensei says that too much ritual and ceremony leads to authoritarianism, because weak people begin to look up to those who are conducting the ceremonies and rituals and shelter behind the ceremonies and rituals, rather than doing their own human revolution, in other words, facing the reality of their own lives. On the other hand, some tradition and formality is extremely important, because it represents continuity and security. For instance, when the youth division representatives who went to Japan went to the Soka Gakkai headquarters, as many of you have also done, and saw for the first time that wonderful Joju Gohonzon that was given to Mr. Toda at his request in 1951, and was really the starting point, as well as being the prime point, of the great movement which Mr. Toda led for Kosen Rufu. When they saw that Gohonzon, it was most meaningful to them. This was history. This was continuity. This is very important, isn't it? Likewise, if you go to the head temple, you see continuity, don't you, in tradition and ceremony, which is important. That's to say, the Daigo Honzon, the whole 700 years worth of Ushitora Gonyos, the Niedo Temple, and the knowledge that there are many gonzens there inscribed by Nichiren Daishonin and by Nikko Shonin. This has a deep importance to our lives. Now, even in NSUK, too, we've already some traditions. They're beginning to develop, and they're good. Traditions like Kosanufu Gongyo at Richmond, or like summer courses every year, being able to go and attend courses at Tretz, having an AGM every year. These are all sort of milestones, aren't they, or pillars of security. On the other hand, if there's too much, then, as I said, it can become extremely dangerous and can lead to the glorification of the people who are conducting the rituals. The sensei said, ritual can be the friend of authoritarianism, he said. Friend of authoritarianism. Some people say, if I go to church, I'll be okay. That's good to go to church. But in fact, of course, going to church is nothing, is it? What you do in church is the important thing. But they go to church sheltering behind the ritual and ceremony, avoiding, escaping from actually facing themselves. At least this is my experience. Yesterday evening we had quite a tremendous question time. Quite a few young people there, and some of them were really angry young people. I don't mean necessarily angry against Buddhism, but just angry young people. So we had a great time, and very lively. But one girl said to me, she came up at the end, she was a sad-looking girl, and she said to me, I was coming here because I thought I was going to hear something beautiful, she said. And all I've heard about is battling, with life. So she wanted to escape, didn't she? Really, this was what made her say that. It was too much for her at that time to contemplate facing her life and the reality of it. So like the Nembutsu, she wanted to escape. If I'd said, if you chant Namamida Butsu, without a shadow of doubt, you'll go to the Pure Land in the West, she would probably have thought that was beautiful, and in her ears she would have been hearing the music of angels. But of course it wasn't what we were talking about, so she was disappointed and a bit angry. So tradition then must be balanced with freedom of expression. This is the point. Sensei said when he was talking about this that there can be only two reasons for traditions. One is to help us to deepen our faith, and the second is to help us to strengthen unity. Those are the only two excuses for traditions, ceremony, rituals. If they don't satisfy those 2 points, they should be scrapped. Because also, Sensei many times has said, don't hedge yourself in by rituals and rules and regulations any more than is necessary. I remember him saying to that on the roof of the Toda Memorial Hall to the Beck brothers several years ago. Don't hedge yourself in by unnecessary rules and regulations. So we have to find the middle way, don't we? I'm saying this all to you because you've got to guard this in the future. After I'm long gone, you have to guard this point and make sure that never, that sounds like Dr. Paisley, that never do we allow ourselves to become hedged in by unnecessary rules, regulations, and ritual. And please watch it in your districts and chapters. It very easily happens. Very easily. So only those that are important for those two reasons, deepening faith and strengthening unity. They're the only reasons for it. So let's look just for a moment to try and explain what I'm getting at some examples. Looking at Nichiren Shoshu, that is to say the priestly order of Nichiren Shoshu. So an example is the form of Gongyo, isn't it? Gongyo was not invented by Nichiren Daishonin. Nichiren Daishonin taught that you should do each part of Gongyo But he didn't invent the whole ceremony we call gongyo. And then a wise high priest, about 100 years after Nichiren Daishonin died, put his guidance together in the form of gongyo to help us carry out our daily practice properly. So this is a wonderful tradition, isn't it, that certainly satisfied both reasons for tradition, that is, say, deepening faith and increasing unity. But then on the other hand, after High Priest Nikken was inaugurated in 1979, he suddenly said, do you remember, we'll now hold the beads, please, with the 2 tassels in the left hand and the 3 tassels in the right. And everyone said, why? Some people were a little bit irritated, even and upset by it. What's the high priest doing, saying we must do it that way? Because before that, we'd all been doing it the other way around. But in fact, the priests had always done it, apparently with the 2 over the left hand. But it had more significance than that. It was a tiny action in a way. But a high priest was cementing unity around himself. If you could just do that small action of changing from having the tassels over your right hand, the 2 over your right hand, to the 2 over your left, and just follow his reasoning, which was that we should all be doing things in the same way, and we could do that without any bad feelings in us, then I think that was good human revolution. But most important of all, it was symbolic of centering ourselves around the new high priest. This was the reason for it. So then, of course, there are the offerings, candles and incense and water. So this again is ritual and ceremony, isn't it? But it has a purpose, which is to deepen our faith. Because as we all know, if we neglect those offerings, which Nichiren Daishonin anyway said we should make, if we neglect it, then we discover we're neglecting ourselves. So that satisfies the 2 purposes. Also, another fascinating thing at the head temple, which we attended the Oeshiki ceremony, which is when the spirit of Nichiren Daishonin, is one of the 2 great ceremonies of the year at the head temple. In the autumn, Oeshiki, and in the spring, the ceremony when they air the gohonzons, all the gohonzons that are stored there, and the original gosho, and so on. But at this ceremony called Oeshiki, towards the end of it, we were asked to go into the great lecture hall, and there they had on a video, direct from the Miedo temple, a ceremony of Sansan Kudo. You know what Sansan Kudo is? We do it in weddings, sharing the 3 cups. But this was an incredible ritual. It took 15 minutes, I guess, for the high priest who was being served with the sake in these cups to be given the first cup. The ritual was so complicated. But it was very beautiful to watch. And to begin with, I was saying inside myself, what is all this about? What is the purpose of all this? It was very impressive because 2 priests did it, and their movements were in exact unity together, pouring the sake out of the barrel and everything, and then carrying it, turning right and left and forward and taking 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. It was amazing to watch, but it was perfectly done. And I suddenly realized this, of course, must be one of the ways the priests do their human revolution. Because if you had a bad thought in you, if you were disrespecting somebody or the high priest or having to be involved in the ceremony, you could never have conducted those movements so perfectly. They were carried out with the purest possible mind. So again, even that piece of ritual has a purpose so far as the priesthood is concerned. That I'm convinced of, which is the young priests who have to go through it really have to struggle with themselves in order to purify their lives sufficiently to do it and do their human revolution. Then, of course, there are many other examples of rituals or rules or ways of doing things, rather, which we have in the Gakkai, we have in NSUK, and I've mentioned some of them. On the other hand, there are lots of things we don't have to do we? We don't have to have Oriental-looking Butsadans. We can have very plain Western-looking Butsadans. We don't have to take our shoes off when we go into even Shohondo to see the Daigo Honzen. We don't have to. In fact, probably sometimes, I think in Richmond, I rather wished sometimes people kept their shoes on. And I think when we have a new centre, we won't take our shoes off. We're much more sensible. But also we don't have to kneel. If we wish to, we can sit. We don't have to do Gongyo before breakfast. If we wish to, we can do it after breakfast. These sort of things, you see. But it can be very easy, just because someone always does Gongyo before breakfast, for him to say to somebody else, you should do Gongyo before breakfast. That's, isn't it, creating unnecessary rules and regulations. So perhaps that gives you an idea of what Sensei was getting at when he went into this in so much detail. So we only need have rules and regulations where they are necessary to deepen faith and proper practice, in other words. And, of course, we encourage unity by certain ceremonies and traditions. Everything else should be scrapped. Please watch it. And if you see anything now in NSUK where you think it's not satisfying those 2 points, you should tell me or somebody. There's something going wrong. We want to keep it free as we possibly can. On the other hand, we want to keep the necessary ceremony and ritual, which we can all really enjoy and which encourages and deepens our faith and unity. So let's keep a careful watch on that point. So I think we can move on from there to look at the answer.
The host, anxious to clarify his words, replied, "To be sure, Buddha halls stand rooftop to rooftop, and sutra storehouses are ranged eve to eve. Priests are as numerous as bamboo plants and rushes, monks as common as rice and hemp seedlings. The temples and priests have been honored from centuries past, and every day respect is paid them anew. But the monks and priests today are fawning and devious, and they confuse the people and lead them astray. The rulers and his ministers lack understanding and fail to distinguish between truth and heresy." The Ninno Sutra, for example, says, "Evil monks, hoping to gain fame and profit, in many cases appear before the ruler, the heir apparent or the other princes, and take it upon themselves to preach doctrines that lead to the violation of the Buddhist law and the destruction of the nation. The rulers, failing to perceive the truth of the situation, listen to and put faith in such doctrines and proceed to create regulations that are perverse in nature and do not accord with the rules of Buddhist discipline. In this way, they bring about the destruction of Buddhism and of the nation." The Nirvana Sutra states, "Bodhisattvas, have no fear in your hearts because of such things as wild elephants, but evil friends, they are what you should fear. If you are killed by a wild elephant, you will not fall into any of the 3 evil paths. But if evil friends lead you to your death, you are certain to fall into one of them." The Lotus Sutra says, "There will be monks in that evil age with perverse views and hearts that are fawning and crooked, who will say they have attained what they have not attained, being proud and boastful in heart. Or there will be forest-dwelling monks, wearing clothes of patched rags and living in retirement, who will claim they are practicing the true way, despising and looking down on the rest of mankind. Greedy for profit and nourishment, they will preach the Dharma to white-robed laymen, and will be respected and revered by the world as though they were arhats who possessed the 6 supernatural powers. Constantly they will go about among the populace, seeking in this way to slander us. They will address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and great patrons of Buddhism, as well as the other monks, slandering and speaking evil of us, saying, These are men of perverted views who preach the doctrines of heretical sects. In a muddied kalpa, in an evil age, there will be many different things to fear. Demons will take possession of others, and through them curse, revile, and heap shame on us. The evil monks of that muddied age, failing to understand the Buddha's expedient means, how he preaches the Dharma in accord with what is appropriate, will confront us with foul language and angry frowns. Again and again we will be banished. In the Nirvana Sutra, the Buddha says, "After I have passed away and countless hundreds of years have gone by, all the sages of the 4 stages will also have passed away. After the former day of the law has ended and the middle day of the law has begun, there will be monks who will give the appearance of abiding by the rules of monastic discipline, but they will scarcely ever read or recite the sutras, and instead will crave all kinds of food and drink to nourish their bodies. Though they wear the robes of a monk, they will go about searching for alms like so many huntsmen, spying sharply and stalking softly. They will be like a cat on the prowl for mice. And constantly they will reiterate these words, 'I have attained the state of Arhat.' Outwardly they will seem to be wise and good, but within they will harbour greed and jealousy. And when they are asked to preach the Dharma, they will conceal it, like Brahmins who have taken a vow of silence. They are not true monks. They merely have the appearance of monks. Consumed by their erroneous views, they slander the true law." When we look at the world in the light of these passages of Scripture, we see that the situation is just as they describe it. If we do not admonish the evil monks, how can we hope to do good?
Thank you. So the key point is in those last 3 lines. If we do not admonish the evil monks, how can we hope to do good? And in this particular answer, Nichiren Daishonin turns from expounding the principle of the 3 calamities and 7 disasters to the cause of the apathy of the people, which is the monks and priests who are teaching incorrectly, teachings which are harmful rather than beneficial, such as the Nembutsu. And he quotes from the Ninno Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, and the Lotus Sutra relentlessly. So he doesn't give up. Although the traveller is angry, he doesn't give up. He goes on patiently explaining to this man, through quoting from Shakyamuni's teachings, why the situation today is as it is. So we, in this day and age, should take note of that. We're born into an age which is often termed the permissive society, isn't it? Let him do his thing. I'll get on with my thing. But if his thing is causing suffering, both to himself or herself and to the people generally, how can we let him go on? How can we go on saying, oh, let him do his thing, I'll get on with mine? In the case of the bodhisattvas of the earth, it just isn't good enough, is it? But unfortunately, we're born into a society which molds us into thinking that. Let them do their thing. We'll do ours. That's okay, but not if it's spreading suffering and causing pain, taking away life force or breeding apathy, a fatalistic view of life, or, for that matter, encouraging greed or a hunger for power or money. It comes back to the point, doesn't it, of opening the eyes. We have to open the eyes of people, because if we don't, this world will never go right. And this we can understand totally by studying the RISSHO ANKOKU RON. So, of course, Nichiren Daishonin, in his very strong, strict words, harsh words about these monks and priests, he's not slandering them as human beings. He is attacking them for what they're doing, which is to preach teachings which are bringing suffering. due of course often to ignorance, other times to arrogance. Whatever happens, misleading the people. So he is saying we have to stop them from doing this. Otherwise things will go from bad to worse. So I made a note at Tretz, when Sensei was in Tretz in 1981, he said, studying the gosho is not playing with theoretical ideology. It is the source of power with which to challenge daily life. Studying the gosho is not playing with theoretical ideology. It is the source of power with which to challenge daily life. So, of course, what Nichiren Daishonin was up against was priests who were playing about with theory and impressing everyone with their erudite minds. And we see the same sort of people in society today. So just to go back and ask John to read that paragraph, which is so important, on page 15.
The Nirvana Sutra states, Bodhisattvas, have no fear in your hearts because of such things as wild elephants, but evil friends, they are what you should fear. If you are killed by a wild elephant, you will not fall into any of the three evil paths. But if evil friends lead you to your death, you are certain to fall into one of them.
I hope you all follow that in most important paragraph. It's only evil friends who can distort our minds and therefore cause us to fall into hell. That's what Nichiren Daishonin is referring to, being killed in the sense of our pure minds being poisoned. Much better, he says, to be trampled on and killed by an elephant, because that's not going to distort one's mind. The worst thing is to have one's mind distorted by evil friends or evil teachers. They may be evil in ignorance, or they may be evil knowing they're being evil. But far more often, certainly, they're evil out of ignorance. But you do find, even amongst people you know, those who are evil because they wish to be evil and get gratification from being so. So when the high priest, Nichiren, admonished the priests who had rebelled and refused to recognize him, he said at that time that they should be careful whose opinions they listened to, he said, even if they were their own favorite classmates. In other words, people they were at school with. So I think, pure, straightforward minds are often the most vulnerable to evil. Because they're pure, because they can't believe that anyone could be evil and could be sowing evil thoughts. So I don't know what caused the high priest to say that, but probably there were priests there who were gullible and who had listened to the evil stirrings up of someone who was their classmate at one time, and through that had some hold over them. So also I remember, and probably you've heard me mention it before, when in Nagasaki, the mayor of Nagasaki, in a conversation over a cup of tea with Sensei, said, why is it that that the Russian people are so aggressive? And Sensei said to him, in my opinion, the Russian people are not aggressive, but they have aggressive rulers under whose control they are. And then he said, people who live in places which are cold and have ice and snow are always very pure-minded, and therefore the most easily manipulated by power-hungry rulers. So I feel those priests who rebelled, many of them were manipulated by men who were evil in nature and mind. So we have to be careful too. Any of us could be under such attack at any time, and choose our friends carefully. So Nichiren Daishonin could have had two choices, couldn't he? He could have written, he could have not spoken out, not fought back against persecution, or he could have done what he did, which was to fight and write the RISSHO ANKOKU RON so that it would last forever. As a result of that, he won. SGI is concrete proof that he won. It's taken a long time, but he won. And just as the gosho says, Kosen Rufu is spreading all over the world. So we have to have the same president, the same spirit. And it was the presidents of the Soka Gakkai, of course, who continued with that great spirit. Also, I think High Priest Nikken. He fought and he won. The three presidents of the Soka Gakkai, Makiguchi, Toda, and Sensei, all had to fight against incredible odds, but they won. Just as we can always win. So again, at that same time, the High Priest said the greatest good is to embrace the true law. The greatest evil is to slander it. So this is how we have to judge those whom we put our trust in, I think. So of course, because the greatest good is to embrace the true law, and the greatest evil is to slander it, if we're actually teaching the law, we also must counter false teachings, those who are slandering the law. And this is what Nichiren Daishonin does in the RISSHO ANKOKU RON, and in many other gosho, doesn't he? And which we also have to do. So we live in a non-Buddhist country. We can be polite and courteous, but we can't give in. If someone is slandering the law through their behavior, we have to struggle to try and point it out. Now, of course, sometimes they may get angry, but provided we're patient and courteous, we can do it without that. Many people in this country are slandering life out of their ignorance, aren't they? Slandering the true law out of total ignorance of it. So these people, we have to gradually persuade and debate with. Of course, we won't win in every case. And I'm sure many of you who are doing great shakabuku, you face that sort of situation sometimes, where people really find it very difficult to understand that they're actually slandering the law of life by going against life itself. So we don't have to uproot centuries of Christian teachings or attack the Christian church. We don't have to do anything like that. We don't have to refute and get involved in religious arguments and refute Christian doctrine or Islamic doctrine or Judaic doctrine. It's unnecessary, because we can bring everything down to practicalities, can't we? We don't have to argue shakabuku on that level. The questions that are important for us to get an answer to are not all that theory and mumbo-jumbo. It's, are you suffering? Are you sick? Are you poor? Isn't it? This is the way we can do it. Are you suffering because you can't seem to establish good relationships with anybody? These are the points, aren't they, that we can base our discussions on. And through that, gradually point out the existence of the law of cause and effect and the difference between slandering the law and living in rhythm with it. And the people say, are you saying this is the only way to enlightenment? You say, yes, it is. Of course, that's my belief, my experience, but I believe too what the Buddha taught. Yes, it is the only way.